7569. Get your walking foot and your ballpoint needle and let's sew.
First thing that we did was we pinned the lining onto the bodice. I guess this is the halter view. So I pinned all the pieces. Now, I chose to do my lining the same as the fabric, but you could do a tricot, which is like a tan or a nude color. So then after you've done that, now we're just using a long stitch to baste all of the edges together, all the way around all sides of the pattern piece. Making sure to keep all of your edges even. You don't want to stretch it. So usually you would pivot at the corners, but because these are basting stitches and you're going to be pulling them out, you want to come all the way off. And then you're just going to pick up and start again. Okay, so no pivoting because you want to pull these threads out. We have our edges all basted down. So I'm going to mark the right side of my fabric because this all looks the same, right? Since I didn't use a tricot lining, I kind of used the fabric, self-fabric lining. On the seam line, 5/8 inch, we are going to machine stitch a long stitch and stop at the notches on both sides. Okay, now we're gonna stitch the bodice front center sections together. So these are my right sides. I'm gonna put my right sides down. I'm going to pin from this edge and I'm gonna stop at this mark, okay? Excuse my nails. Stop at this mark and you're gonna leave this open. So we're gonna stitch here, right on this line and stop there. Okay, so I pinned this and I stopped here. I'm gonna place my needle on this line. We have the line that our pattern piece gave us for marking. And we're just gonna sew in a regular stitch to that line, okay? Okay, I trimmed all my threads except my basting threads, those threads from the edges that we did earlier, but trim everything else and make sure it's nice. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge of the self-facings on both sides. I'm gonna pull the basting stitch out that was holding the edges together now. So you just take one. And pull it out. Okay, and after you do that, just check the fabric, make sure everything is good. You are going to fold in on this edge and I'm gonna press this. You wanna use a pressing cloth, just don't damage the fabric. So I'm gonna hold this 1/4 inch down, press that, and then I'm gonna fold it in on the fold line marking here. And I'm gonna press that, okay? And then we're going to stitch down this side, all right? The directions make it look like you're sewing this down because that's what it says, sew down the edge. But the picture shows the edge lifted up and there's like a blind hem stitch underneath. So when I thought about it, I was like, okay, I don't want a line to show on the outside of this bodice. So this has to mean that I am sewing this down by hand. It doesn't say blind hem, it doesn't say sew by hand, but that's what we need to do, okay? So I have my matching thread and my needle here. I'm just gonna start at the top, make sure, lay this flat, make sure everything lays flat and that you've pinned everything in place. And you're just gonna keep the pins in as you sew. And you're just gonna start by catching in the right underneath the edge. You're gonna kind of go underneath the edge and you're gonna catch in the lining. You do not want the stitch to show on the outside at all. So you're just gonna be attaching it to the lining. Okay, so now I've hand stitched the whole way down for the facing pieces. This is some tracing dust and I dripped some water on it, so don't worry about that. So now we are going to use a long stitch and we are going to just sew the outer edge here. We're just gonna base this upper edge. Okay, now I've started marking my fold for the back of the bodice. So I'm just kind of marking the upper edge where I'm gonna fold it in at, so the fold line. And I'm using a straight stitch, a loose, long, straight stitch. Okay, so this is my bodice front. And this is the back. And we'll clean all this up. Don't worry about the water and some of the chalk. I'm going to serge these edges here to clean it up and make it look nice. And I'm going to serge the top edge of the bodice back that we just did, just the outer edge. I'm just gonna serge it to clean it up. Then we're gonna fold in on our line that we just made, our fold line. And we're gonna pin because this part is gonna get stitched down. So go ahead and do that. Finished off the edges and clean things up a bit. And now we're going to sew that back edge that we've made. I'm gonna sew this on a straight, very narrow straight stitch. I'm sorry, very narrow stretch stitch, so really tiny zigzags. Okay, so we have our straight stretch stitch, and then remember the stitching is zigzag, but it's very, very tiny, so it gives the fabric some stretch, okay, because you're going to have the elastic here. So I went ahead and pulled out my thread that marked the depth of this fold, and I'm going to go ahead and use piece 3, which is the elastic guide, and I'm going to cut my elastic for my pattern measurement, and I'm going to insert it and baste on the edges. So I have my 1/4 inch wide elastic, and I'm going to cut here. I'm going to use my elastic guiding tool. And I'm going to insert pull it through. I'm going to have the elastic extend. So you want it to extend maybe like 5/8 inch. I'm just going to sew that in place on the edge here. And put it back on a straight stitch. Okay, I'm going to do that to both sides. Okay, so the instructions say to have the edges of the elastic even, but it makes it too loose to me when you do that. So I always extend mine about 5/8 inch on both sides, or maybe even a little longer when I try it on and kind of fit it on the person. Then I'm going to go ahead and trim those elastic pieces off. Okay. I am going to go ahead and I'm going to put a 5/8 base stitch in the armhole edge or the arm edge. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, so we're gonna do a long loose stitch down this side. So this is the opening, this is your neckline. We're gonna do 5/8 inch here, okay? And remember, it's a loose stitch, a basting stitch. You're gonna pull this out. do this to both sides. Now remember, the instructions don't say to do this. I'm just telling you to do this because I read ahead and know what it wants us to do. It's gonna make your life a lot easier. We're gonna do it to both sides. We're gonna attach the front to the back. And I've went off instructions a little bit and did my own thing because I know it's gonna make life easier. So we're gonna take both pieces, bodice back and front, facing the right sides to each other. And I'm going to start out with the notches. I'm gonna pin. And it's best to use ballpoint needles for everything. So ballpoint needles for pinning, ballpoint needles for sewing, when you're using knit fabric. So I'm gonna line everything up. And remember, I like to sew whenever there's a gather. I like to have the gather facing me so I can control how it's sewn. But we're going to, remember that 5/8 inch that we just did? We're gonna put this and line it up with that, okay, with the back. Now the instructions don't tell you to do this, but this is gonna make everything much nicer and cleaner. So I'm gonna take the top edge of the back and line it up just under that 5/8 inch stitch that we just put in, okay? I'm gonna pin that. And some of these threads we're gonna pull out, so just do your best to kind of ignore them right now. All right, so remember, we have that gathering stitch in the bodice. We are going to need to pull that up because it has to fit, right? So make sure the back is nice and smooth. We're gonna pull this piece up. Now you're pulling that gathering thread and just adjust everything evenly, okay? To make sure that it fits along the back. This is gonna give it a nice form fit. All right, so we're gonna pin. You're gonna do this to both sides. Okay, so we have everything pinned and we have everything gathered up and smoothed, fitting perfectly with the back. Now we're gonna go ahead and with a regular straight stitch, we're going to start at the top edge of the back. You don't need to go all the way to the edge of this. You can if you want, but you're going to start sewing there. And we're gonna sew all the way down. And we're just gonna be kind of smoothing as we go along with that gathered part. Making sure to catch in or sew on top of that gathered line we put in. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and look and see if there's any threads that I can start pulling out. You just want to make sure you smooth them. Okay. Sometimes there's threads along the edges here and you can just start pulling those out. A lot of them will get serged out, so that's not a problem. Okay, so now if you don't have a serger, you're just going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the original line and press your seam forward. But I'm gonna go ahead at this time and I'm going to serge down the side seams on both sides. And then I'm also going to serge the very edges of the bodice, the part that we marked, okay? Now, the instructions say to fold over this edge and then fold again and sew. But because I did my back serged on the edge and fold over and sewn, I'm gonna do my front the same exact way so that when I fold it over, everything will be exactly the same and lined up. Okay, so I'm looking at my bodice from the back and I want to keep this line in because that's where I'm gonna fold over 5/8 inch. We did that. The instructions do not tell you to do that, but it's gonna make your life a lot easier. But I also have this basting that I did on the edges at the beginning when we first joined the lining and the bodice fabric together. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull that out now. Okay, so usually I would pin on the top and do a top stitch, but I'm gonna be doing this straight stitch down the side and I'm pinning on the inside because I'm gonna have to kind of curve in to meet this line here, and I wanna make sure everything is smooth and meets together. So I'm gonna pin and stitch from the inside. Also, make sure to try the dress on at this point before you sew down one of the sides. I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna top stitch. I'm not doing a stretch stitch for this because I want it to fit and not have much give along this side edge. I want it to be snug up against her chest on this side under her arm, and there'll be plenty of stretch in the fabric and in this part. So we're gonna go ahead and just stitch straight. I'm gonna try to make it as even on this side all the way down as possible. Okay, so before we move on to the collar, I just want to show you my bodice piece so far. So here we have, and I haven't ironed it, so you want to press everything down. So this is the stitching, okay? And most of my threads have been pulled out. We still have a few more to pull out. All right, so we're going to set our bodice aside, and now we're going to work on the neckline. So you are going to, it's like a choker neckline, right? So we're gonna find our markings for the 2 dots that are on the pattern piece, and you are going to stitch through those dots. Stitch through, I don't know, probably, I think the normal pattern call when you're stitching through dots is like 1 inch on each side. So I'll start a little bit out, just approximate about 1 inch, and we're gonna stitch through. Okay, 1 inch before, 1 inch after. And then I'm going to do that through both circles. And then we're going to clip to the dot or to the marking. Find those dots or those markings that you made, and we're just going to clip to them. Okay, on both sides. Okay, I forgot to mention that on my bodice, I've already basted through the top of my bodice before I moved on to the collar, and you'll see that in the pattern instructions. So I already did that. So now we're gonna sew right sides together. We're making our collar now. So you're gonna pin this down, right sides together, all the way around. And you're gonna leave open between those notches that we made, between here. Okay, so I've pinned my collar and my lining, and I'm going to start where the notch or the small circle is, the marking. I put a pin where I need to start because sometimes it's really hard to see. So I'm gonna start right there. You're gonna pivot at the corner. You're gonna sew all the way around and come back where you have the last notch there, okay? Okay, so we finished sewing. Okay, I want to make sure I stopped at the right spot. We're gonna trim and turn this right side out, okay? So go ahead and trim and then turn your collar right side out. I just wanted to mention, as you're trimming, do not trim that center piece here between those circles. Leave this, okay? You're just gonna trim the outside edges here. Okay, so this is what your collar should look like. And I'm gonna get my turning tool. I'm just gonna stick it in the center. And I'm gonna use my pointy part, push it through just enough to get it started. And then gently use the point of the tool to just kind of get everything into place and get your points and edges, everything nice and smooth, okay? You don't wanna push too hard because you will push through your knit fabric and make a hole. You don't want that. Okay, so we have pinned our bodice here, right sides facing the right side of what's going to be your collar, and you've matched up the little notch areas and your notches here, your markings here, okay? So we're going to sew this in a 5/8 inch seam. Make sure that you keep the back lining out of the way. And keep everything nice and smooth. Okay, so we have our neck sewn on. So the instructions don't tell you to do this, but I am going to make sure everything is perfectly even when I fold it over. I'm going to stitch a 5/8 inch seam line here. So it's gonna be like marked. So when I fold over exactly where it's supposed to be, okay? This just makes everything nice and neat and precise, more precise. So you're just gonna sew it as far as you can. And you can do like a regular stitch too. My machine was just on a long stitch. So when you fold over, you're gonna do this. Okay, so you fold over right on that line and everything will be perfectly even. Before you do that, you want to trim this down to 3/8 inch. So I'm going to trim about this much off. Where's my scissors? Okay, so you want to trim. So that you're within 5/8 inch of that fold line. I'm sorry, 3/8 inch of the fold line. And then we're gonna fold this under, iron it, press it, and then pin. Okay, here's my collar. So now I'm going to serge, or you could do another stitching line as the instructions say, 1/4 inch away. But I'm gonna go ahead and serge because it's gonna trim down my collar a little bit on the inside, the seam allowance here. It's gonna trim this down a little bit, okay? So we're gonna do that, and I'm gonna press it towards the collar, and I'm going to press under this, and then I'm going to pin, okay? Okay, this is what your neckline should look like. You have folded it in along your stitching, made sure that it's nice and going to look nice and smooth and curved and looks good on both sides and even. Now you're going to pull out your basting thread that marked your seam, and you're gonna hand stitch, slip stitch this collar down. You don't want any needle marks to come through the other side. You're gonna do it so it's kind of like a blind to the other side. And then we're going to sew, I'm gonna sew snaps on the back edges, like the instructions say to sew hook and eyes, I think. But I'm gonna be sewing snaps because I feel like it's more secure if you're dancing and moving around. The hook and eyes can kind of shift. So I'm gonna sew snaps here. Okay, so we have our collar and it is attached and stitched and ironed. So now I'm going to sew my snaps onto the back, and I'm going to be using these sew-on snaps, and they're size 1. The snaps sewn. Okay, we have our neckline here, or a collar, sorry. And we have our snaps. So we've got our snaps here, okay? And nothing showing through the collar. The skirt, the mini skirt portion of your pattern, you're gonna take this to a nice big space and lay out the lining on the wrong side of the skirt fabric, right? So this is the right side, this is the wrong side. Pin all the way around, we did this already, and then you're going to stitch a loose stitch just to baste the lining onto the skirt. I'm just gonna go right near the edge. Okay, so smooth everything out after you finished attaching the lining to the skirt. And you're gonna go on a big flat space, and we're going to pin our skirt pieces together, front sides facing in. And we're gonna stitch in a 5/8 inch seam. If you have a serger, serge the sides and then press to the back. Nice and smooth. So we're gonna go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 inch straight stitch down each side. In the interim of doing this video, since I'm sewing this for someone else, you want to stop along the way and make sure you're fitting the garment to your body. I ended up bringing the front deep V up higher because this young lady felt too exposed because the opening is very deep plunging. And if you have full breast, it's going to be very revealing. Okay, so now you're going to find your front skirt pieces, those mermaid portions, and you'll know it's the front of the skirt. It's number 10, but you should have some markings on the front piece. Okay, so we're only going to sew the seam in the front piece at this time. So you're going to make sure you're doing your 5/8 inch. You're going to sew this front piece, and then we're going to serge it if you have a serger and press to one side. Okay, so I've pressed the center seam of the front pieces, 10, so I've serged it, and I'm going to put a sticker on that center seam so I know exactly where the front is. Okay. That's my front. Now you're going to go sew piece 11, the back pieces, together the same way. We're going to sew our back pieces now. Same 5/8 inch, and then serge and push to one side. Okay, so I've got my back seam stitch, serged, and pressed to the side. And now I'm going to attach it to the front skirt. On each will have a big pile of fabric. The best thing for you to do when pinning this is to lay out your front piece flat on a table facing up, and then pin your back piece facing down so that you have the side seams on both sides nice and splayed out on the floor, on a big table. I put it across my cutting table, and just in case that sticker comes off, I put a pin on the middle seam, just in case, so that I know this is my front, okay? Okay, you want to make sure that you keep your fabric nice and smooth, that you're sewing, no lumps and bumps, and no pulling, okay? Now, we are going to take that upper waist area of this flounce, and we're just going to start with one side here. Keep the seam facing towards the back. So we've got our front here. I'm going to sew a stay stitch, which is just a regular stitch, about 3/8 of the way from the edge, and you're just going to stitch that so that it doesn't allow this area to stretch. You don't want it to be overstretched while you're attaching it to the bodice, okay? So we're going to stay stitch here. I'm just going to come in. I'm just going to stitch around the whole thing. Okay, in the directions, it states that you should do the 5/8 inch seam on the hem. But I'm gonna let my fabric hang, and so everything will rest and stretch out. And my customer is gonna come, you know, the person I'm sewing this for, she's gonna come and have a final fitting, and I'm going to mark the length of the hem on her and then sew the hem. So my hem is gonna be finished last. So now we are going to attach the flounce to the bottom edge of the skirt. So make sure you are holding the right part. So I know my waist is more narrow than the bottom, right? And I'm looking at my notches here. So this is my top. So the bottom of my skirt is here. I'm going to insert my skirt into the flounce, and this is right sides together, okay? So this is my back, this is my front. The skirt, it doesn't matter. I am going to start with my side seams, making sure that both of my side seams are pointing the same way. I'm gonna find them, line them up, and I'm gonna pin there. I'm gonna do the same to the other side, and then I'm gonna find my notches. Right, so we've found both side seams. We're gonna find our notches. So I've got my notch here and my notch here. I'm gonna line them up and pin. And then you're going to ease everything in all the way around once you finish aligning your notches and pinning. I'm making sure to start, I always start sewing on a side seam. So we're gonna go ahead and sew on a side seam in a very narrow zigzag stitch to allow stretch in the garment, okay? So we're gonna do that now. And you're at 5/8 inch all the way around. Okay, I'm gonna check and make sure everything is smooth all the way around before I sew. No lumps or bumps. And then I'm gonna serge it and then press the seams. And then we're going to go on to attach the bottom. Okay, so we've gone ahead and we've attached the flounce to the lower edge of the skirt, and we've serged and pressed the seams up. Now we're gonna go on to attach the bodice. Make sure you see where your front is, okay? Because it's shorter in the front and then has the train going out. Okay, so you've got the front here and then the train part in the back, okay? So make sure you pin or have some sticker or some type of marking to let you know where the center front is. Okay, so I'm going to take the front of my skirt, and I have the front of my bodice. Here's the front, here's the neck here. So I'm going to insert this on the inside of my skirt. and making sure that my front here is towards the front. So you have right sides together. You're gonna pin, and then you're going to start at a side seam, stitch in a 5/8 inch seam. Do not cut anything, serge anything, don't do any of that. While pinning the back, I came to the notches, and the notches do not match up. So you're just gonna have to ease in the back as best as possible. Just going to have to ease it in the best as possible. You see, they're totally off. So I'm gonna start with my sides, pin it. You could also fold the pieces and mark your center. I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna start with my sides and kind of go to the center. Perfectly fine, it's just the notches are off. I'm going to start with a side seam, and then we are going to stitch in 5/8 inch. And I'm doing the stretch stitch again, the narrow zigzag. Okay, so we have finished sewing our bodice. Before we get to this next step, I just want to kind of trim things up. Now we are going to insert elastic into the band that we're about to make here. It's like a hidden kind of an elastic waistband. So we're going to go ahead and find a side seam again, and we're going to make sure that we sew about 1/4 of the way in here, okay? So we're gonna sew probably to right about there, and you're going to stop. So I'm gonna start, as you see it opens, right? So I'm gonna start probably right here. And I'm gonna end probably right here. Okay, because you want to keep this open so that you can insert your elastic in. Now on the pattern, it doesn't mention what size of elastic. I chose a 1/4 inch elastic. It said it would be mentioned inside the pattern, and I didn't see it anywhere. So I've been using a 1/4 inch, right? So we're going to go ahead and do that. And we're just doing the zigzag stitch again. Hidden kind of elastic band. But I want to pull out those loose threads. Remember those basting stitches we put in at the very beginning when we were attaching different fabric? The lining and the skirt. I want to pull those out. So I've measured my 31 inches of elastic. I have it on my elastic tool here. I'm going to find that space that we left, and I'm going to insert the elastic. Okay, so I've threaded the elastic, and I'm just going to kind of smooth everything out. Okay, and I want to take a look at it on the right side just to kind of see if I need to gather a little bit more. You don't want it to be too gathered, and I've adjusted the dress for it to fit her closely. And I will say that this pattern ran large to me in the bodice and the waist. The hips, not so much, slightly large, but for this young lady anyway. And according to the measurements, the finished measurements of the pattern, they were much bigger than what the finished, actual finished measurements were. To stitch 5/8 inch, which I've already kind of taken out about 5/8 inch of this elastic. Okay, so now we've got our elastic lapped over each other. And we're going to do about 5/8 inch of it or more, depending on how much you adjusted. You might have to make it looser or tighter. And I'm just going to go ahead and sew. going to pull everything through so that it's nice and even. Okay, so this is how our elastic waistband looks. I'm going to just tack it here just to keep the elastic from rolling. That's all you're doing. Just a couple stitches on each side. Then we're gonna press our elastic up. Okay, I used Wonder Tape. You can find it in this package or it comes in different packages as well, but you want it to say Wonder Tape. It completely disappears when you wash it. It doesn't gum up your needle, but it gives knits, when you're doing narrow hems, it gives knits a very stable kind of a feel so that you can get your hem to look nice and crisp, okay, which is hard to do when you're using a knit fabric. So I'm going to just sew a straight stitch with this, and I have my hem pinned all the way around. So I like to start probably in the back. So I'm gonna find the back seam because there is a seam in the back. And I'm going to start sewing my hem at that back center seam. Where is it? There we go. And there's a lot of fabric with this dress, okay? So my seam is right there in the center. So I'm gonna find that. I'm gonna put all the weight of this on the table. I'm gonna do a straight stitch. And I'm just gonna sew all the way around.